meine Damen und Herren. Das New Normal, daran muss man sich erstmal gewöhnen. So sehen jetzt ausverkaufte Räume aus. Einen wunderschönen guten Abend, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Ivan Krastev, dear Shalini Randeria, dear Ulrike Dresdner, Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Bulgaria, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Allianz Cultural Foundation, I have the honor to welcome you here tonight at the Silent Green. Our ceremony tonight for the Jean Améry Award for European Critical Essay Writing is an important event for our foundation, as we have been founded on the idea of Europe. In Europe, we live in a time of profound social and political upheaval at the moment. The pandemic has not made existing inequalities disappear. Instead, I would say it has made them even loom larger as under a magnifying glass. It has brutally exposed our vulnerabilities. The disruption we see around us are challenging the resilience of free democratic societies in Europe and beyond. The President of the European Commission reacted to this in her speech yesterday, when she stated the necessity for the Next Generation EU program to be not just an environmental or economic, but a cultural project. In this room, I know I am, of course, preaching to the choir when I say that for a European future, we need the power of a culture and of the arts to imagine a different world. As you may recognize here in the room, this place used to be a crematorium, turned into, yes, we were just talking about it with Ivan before, but it's not time for the joke yet, for later. This has been a crematorium and turned into one of Berlin's most vibrant cultural spots. We need spaces like this, spaces that are a living symbol of culture's potential for change. We need people who see a crematorium and imagine it as a space that brings people together through the arts. We need artists and writers and cultural practitioners with new ideas, sometimes utopian ideas, for Europe. This is the idea of Europe. This idea of Europe is also the reason to present today the Jean Améry Award to Ivan Krastev, one of Europe's most prominent and most critical public intellectuals. Jean Améry, who inspired this award, was an Austrian-born essayist and resistance fighter. His life illustrates the brutal history of the 20th century in Europe. The reason why the Allianz Cultural Foundation gives an award for European critical essay writing in his memory is a commitment to a common European future. In his inner conflicts and his restless searching, Jean Améry perhaps exemplifies the genre of the critical essay. The work of Ivan Krastev ties into this in showing us the conflictedness of our continent today. That is why the jury, under the leadership of Robert Menasse, has nominated Ivan Krastev as laureate for the Jean Améry Award 2020. And we are especially honored that Shalini Randeria, an outspoken social anthropologist who shows so well in her work the entangled history of our globalized world. That she traveled from Vienna, the native city of Jean Améry, to Berlin and is here with us tonight. She will introduce us to the work of Ivan Krastev and to his thinking in her laudatory speech. Before I give the stage to our moderator, the writer and Max Planck Fellow Thomas Meaney, who will guide us through the evening tonight, I would like to thank our partners. First of all, the International Literature Festival, which is headed by Ulrich Schreiber, which is, after the pandemic, the first international literature festival who really took place. I would like to thank our close partner in this project, the publishing house Klett-Cotta, and my colleagues at the foundation, Katrin Tomanek and Katharina Thomas, who were putting this event together in such challenging circumstances. So thank you very much. I wish us inspiring discussion tonight, and I would hand over, Thomas, now to you. The floor is yours.
It's a great pleasure to be with you all tonight, and it's an especial pleasure to introduce Shalini Randeria. She is the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, der Institut für die Wissenschaft von Menschen, and a professor of social anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, as well as the director of the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. She has written on a dizzying range of subjects in a politically engaged manner, from seed activism to migration, and most recently has examined the response of the Indian state to the corona crisis. She has known Ivan Krastev for several years as they have worked together in Vienna to create one of the most vital intellectual institutions in Europe. And so we're very lucky to have her here tonight to give the laudatio. This will be followed by a brief discussion between Shalini and myself with Ivan, and then it will be followed by the presentation of the Jean Améry Prize. So.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and an honor to deliver the laudatio this evening in honor of Ivan Krastev, who has been awarded the prestigious Jean Améry Prize by the Allianz Kulturstiftung at the International Literature Festival here in Berlin. It's a special occasion for Ivan, but it's also a very special occasion for me, because Ivan is a colleague of mine at the Institute of Human Sciences, so we both traveled together from Vienna, me to celebrate him, Ivan to receive the prize. But Ivan is a close friend of 22 years standing, so I'd like to begin with a personal anecdote. If Ivan was speaking, he would have begun with a joke. But Ivan's jokes are famous. I cannot compete with them, so I'm just going to begin with a very personal anecdote. The year was 1998, and the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin decided that it needed to establish a project to celebrate the new millennium. This was the Agora 2000 project at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. It was supposed to bring together a group of 10 to 15 young scholars from all over the world, an interdisciplinary group which would stay together, work together, think together about the challenges which would face us in the 21st century. I was tasked to help Wolf Lebanese, then rector of the Wissenschaftskolleg, and Yehuda Elkanah to put together this group. And they asked me to attend a conference at the Collegium Budapest, asking me to look for someone from Eastern Europe whom could be invited to join our group. So I came back from this conference after 3 days, and I wrote an email to Yehuda Elkanah, and I found this email again because fortunately I had printed out a copy of the email for myself, and I don't know why, but it's in a file I found, and I'm going to quote from my email. It says, "Dear Yehuda, I found someone. This is a young, unknown Bulgarian. Ivan is trained as a political scientist, but don't worry, he's totally disinterested in the boundaries of his own discipline, as in any other academic discipline. He's sharp and eloquent, boundlessly curious, and I think he'll be great fun to work with because he has a tremendous sense of humor, so lacking in most academics who take themselves far too seriously. What struck me at the conference was the wit and the brevity of his comments. He did not shy away from expressing an opinion confidently, critically, but so politely that most people didn't even realize how critical it was. But this was on every single paper presented at the conference. And then there's a postscript to my email. It says, Yehuda, I must confess, I'm not sure if Ivan was always right, but he always had something original to say because he thinks out of the box and he definitely has a different optic. So we are bound to learn something from his brilliant insights. Today, 22 years later, I think I would underline every word by which I would characterize Ivan from this 3-day meeting at the Budapest conference. Ivan Krastev was invited to join the Agora project, and he chose to work on the topic of corruption at a time when the C word was the buzzword in development aid, but also in debates on the EU enlargement. But of course, characteristically, Ivan's take on the subject had a twist. His prophetic argument was that anti-corruption focused politics were doomed to fail as they misrecognized the problem. In a collection of essays on the politics of anti-corruption titled Shifting Obsessions, he argued that anti-corruption sentiments are not driven by the level of corruption in a country, but by the general disappointment with liberal reform that has caused rising social inequality. A prophetic insight into both the failure of anti-corruption campaigns, but also into rising levels of social inequality. We have since then had the pleasure of seeing in print several volumes of Ivan's essays on the paradoxes of liberal democracy, on the politics of protest, on the current crises of Europe and the future of the EU, on the vexed relationships between Eastern and Western Europe, strained by mutual misperceptions and by the failure of expectations that did not materialize. And many of us awaited eagerly for his column in the New York Times every month. He speaks his mind, but he doesn't polarize. He surprises one with his unusual insights and incisive observations. With his parsimonious and provocative formulations, he is able to seduce one into his way of looking at things. In fact, these memorable phrases are often quoted favorably across the political spectrum, a rare occurrence in the divided political landscape that we inhabit today. If Ivan is able to put forward a plausible explanation and an understanding of Putin's policies, of Orban's policies, and Trump's popularity, without, however, sympathizing with them in the least, it is because he chooses not to condemn outright and from the outset what he disagrees with. Instead, he chooses to make us turn our gaze around to look at an issue from a viewpoint which is not our own. He wants us to understand an opinion at variance with our own, a point of view foreign to us, to see what the world may look like from a very different vantage point and why this could be the case. Ideological blinkers don't cloud his vision, nor does contextual detail clutter his bold comparisons and arguments that yield, for example, some astonishing parallels, for example, recently in an article between Trump and Putin. Ivan Krastev is a translator. He is a dispassionate mediator between worlds who interprets but doesn't judge. His texts bear witness to a keen sense of history and an equally keen sense of history's ironies. He wears his learning lightly, and that makes his essays eminently accessible to a very large audience. His writings are not normative. They neither seek to justify nor are they judgmental. They sometimes even manage to serve quite unpalatable truths, but in small homeopathic doses. They don't upset. They astonish. They astonish with striking observations, with counterintuitive ideas, and especially with a remarkable ability to link the little to the large, and an uncanny ability to unexpectedly derive from the smallest detail a big picture, and then often a bold generalization. His writings don't preach, they often persuade instead by the use of parables, by literary passages cited from some of his favorite fiction writers. Interestingly, Ivan's writings seldom contain a single personal anecdote. So that's why I, who am privy to some of them, cannot resist the temptation to share one with you tonight. Ivan is the first non-literary figure to receive this prestigious Jean Améry award. Of course, he could have received it in addition to the essays for the set of poems he wrote in Bulgarian, his mother tongue, when he was in his late 20s, had these been translated. But I don't know how many of these poems he would have allowed us to read because, of course, being Ivan, he had an intriguing idea about them. He suggested that one way to deal with one's early work would be to reissue it now and then, republish it after a lapse of a few years, but after deleting a poem every time, the one that in retrospect seemed least important, the one that in the judgment of the author had not stood the test of time. Luckily for us, he decided not to apply this ingenious idea to his own essays. Like Jean Améry, in whose memory this prize has been established and is being awarded tonight, Ivan Krastev is a brilliant essayist. He's a Zeitzeuge, an astute observer of our times, and an incisive commentator, whose knowledge of European history and politics is breathtaking. He shares with Améry an elegant style of prose writing. Like Améry, he is an intellectual who often provokes, but without a shrill or an aggressive tone, ever. Ivan Krastev is neither moralizing nor melancholic, and here he differs from Jean Améry. Even his most pessimistic prognoses are delivered without a sense of doom and gloom. He revels instead in forcing us out of our comfort zone, making us aware of the paradoxes that we need to confront. Be it, as I mentioned earlier, that anti-corruption campaigns can have as pernicious political effects as corruption itself, or he has argued more recently that liberal democracy and the welfare state, two of Europe's proudest achievements, may now stand in the way of being able to integrate immigrants. He analyzes some central contradictions of liberal democracies, for example, how to reconcile the establishment and exercise of universal rights in societies which are unequally free and prosperous. The so-called migration crisis, which is at the center of his collection of essays titled After Europe, holds up a mirror to the EU, whose founding myths of human rights, tolerance, and civility now lie exposed. The essays explore the challenges posed today by the very success of the European welfare state with its idea of inclusive solidarity, the problems of liberal democracies, now afraid of the resentment of a section of their electorates, the unease of diversity in nation-state societies that are homogenized after the breakdown of European empires, and the clash of solidarities rather than their lack that marks Europe today. His writings have consistently addressed some of the dilemmas facing the European Union, but he delivers his punches with a velvet-clad fist. So I remember this one memorable sentence he said, "If the EU implodes, it'll be with a whimper, not a bang." Unlike Jean Améry, Ivan Krastev would not define himself as a left intellectual. But this may be because the meaning of such a self-description has changed, not only between Eastern and Western Europe, but between the 20th and the beginning of the 20th and the first decades of the 21st century. However, I think Ivan would probably subscribe to Jean Améry's understanding of a left intellectual as someone who is a free, a skeptical spirit, someone who can think against himself. The essay is his chosen form. Beautifully crafted, his essays whet your appetite, leave you wanting for more. With their laconic style, totally free of jargon and academic pretension, his writings are difficult to classify because they define because they defy conventional labels. He is, as I said, a political scientist by training and a much sought-after political advisor across Europe and a European interlocutor in the US. But his essays are a far cry from articles in academic journals and would stretch the boundaries of his discipline as much as they distinguish themselves from the prescriptive policy briefs that think tanks produce. His writings invite you to shift your perspective slightly, to look at Europe from another angle, from the continent's eastern margins. He positions himself firmly in the recent writings to offer an angle of vision that is colored by his own experience in and of the Balkans. But as he himself will hasten to caution you, it is not that Europe will look any better as seen from those margins. But what you realize when you read Ivan's essays is that yours is not the only perspective. There is always another perspective possible. And that it may be useful, indeed very useful, to look beyond one's own self-conceit. But more importantly, perhaps, what you learn is that there is no immaculate perception. Ivan Krastev is a man for all seasons, a public intellectual with a remarkable sense of self-irony. And he often likes to position himself doubly at the margins by saying his view is that of Bulgarian common sense. May the margins of Europe continue to gift us many more rooted cosmopolitans like Ivan with his brilliance, wit, and charm. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Shalini. And now we'll move into a short discussion with Ivan. Shalini, would you like to begin?
Should I? Okay. So let me start, and then we can both join the discussion with Ivan. So Ivan, let me start with, as I said, there are memorable quotes of Krastev, and one of them in Democracy Disrupted goes something like this: you can tweet a protest, you can even tweet perhaps a revolution, but you cannot tweet an institution. And what characterizes these protest movements is an unwillingness to take over power. Now, we are witness these days to two protest movements, which I think would be interesting to contrast and look at with this insight of yours. One is the Belarus protests, where I would say yes, you can tweet that protest, and the social media is playing a huge role. The question is, do they want power? They definitely want free and fair elections. And of course, they've set up a coordination council, which is not being recognized, etc. But the contrast for me, Ivan, is the Black Lives Matter. Here is a movement. Must it institutionalize itself to have an impact? Would it not be enough if long overdue structural changes could take place without the movement institutionalizing itself?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very grateful. From now on, I can only basically spoil the beautiful picture of myself. I'm really very grateful, first for the prize, and secondly for the very nice words that Shalini was saying. Before going on this, I just want to thank very much the jury for something very specific. I have not read Jean Améry before getting the prize. And the good story about these prizes is that this is kind of a laugh. It's an encounter. You don't expect it. You're not applying for this. You don't know what it is. And somebody calls you. And I found Jean Améry somebody whose ideas resonated incredibly with me, particularly reading it now on 3 issues. And I do believe it has a lot to do also with the bigger intellectual situation Shalini was referring for. One of the major insights of Améry was that he, being a critical, enlightenment kind of created intellectual, being in the concentration camps, he see all these kind of virtues of intellectual critical mind being totally useless. he was totally all the time envying those who believe in God, those who believed in the Communist Party, anybody that has anything kind of a certain to believe in. And this strange idea of the role of the intellectual in the moment of a kind of extreme crisis in which we have our doubts, we have our questions, but we don't know what to do with them, was incredible. And the second thing that he saw during what he saw in his incredible experience with the concentration camps, and this is a literature very different than kind of a classical literature on the concentration camps that you have, was that he said there is no problem of death in the concentration camp. Everything is about dying, how you're going to die, the pain, the real suffering. Death is taken for granted. I believe that I'm quoting rightly. He said, we're living not next to death, we're living in the same room with it. I'm saying this because there was something about COVID-19 that made people very much aware of our mortality, but also the problem of dying and not simply the problem of death. For example, this idea of breathing, everybody these days talking about politics, about death, the idea of suffocation, about breathing is becoming critically important. Black Lives Matter, and I'll go to this, it was, I want to breathe. Mr. Navalny, being in Charité, basically said, today for the first time I'm breathing on my own. This idea of kind of, there is something very strong you can find with him. And also, strangely, this Jewish intellectual that had been living everywhere, that basically had the feeling that he lost his fatherland at the moment when basically all this started, he had an incredible essays, Why You Need Home. Strangely enough, the person who basically fits everything about the most classical story of a cosmopolitan intellectual was saying why he believes that home matters. And by the way, it's very interesting. The article is, at least in English, translated, how much of a home person needs. I'm saying all this, and this is, I'm going to the protests and so on. When I wrote this book, Democracy Disrupted, after the global financial crisis, you have a wave of mass protests around the world. Of course, we all know about Occupy Wall Street and what happened in Spain, but it was in more than 70 countries. We're talking about the millions of people. And there was several characteristics of these movements. First, they were not run by political parties. Even more, they're very much insisting on the fact that they don't have political leaders. Secondly, they were very heterogeneous. And part of their legitimacy comes from being heterogeneous. The idea was we are the people, and the fact that we are so different basically allows us to claim that we are the people. But thirdly, and this is where basically Shalini's question comes, there was a very strong fear of being represented. People were ready to go for hours and hours, days and days, on the streets, without leaders, without speeches, because they were afraid that the moment when the representation comes, they're going to be cheated. And this kind of a protest of mistrust, in which you're basically playing the sovereign, but you're not basically playing power and you're not demanding power, in my view, is something very interesting. So for me, the most interesting was the relations between protests and elections. And of course, here I have a beautiful Bulgarian story from 2013. We have another wave of protests in Bulgaria, but in 2013, there was a protest asking for elections, and then 70% of the people protesting said that they're not sure that they're going to vote on these elections because they were not sure for whom they want to vote. And this is critically important. And for me, the story was, what is about these massive protest movements that make them so powerful? And my answer is the following. There is something interesting about democracy. Democracy represents values, interests, you go, you vote. But there is one thing that democracy does not represent, and this is intensity, the passion of your feeling. You who really care about certain issue, and I who do not care much, both of us has one vote. And from this point of view, representation of intensity is becoming critically important. And this is very much about Black Lives Matter. It's not about simply the institutionalization, which was very important, and the movement was mainstreamed, and it goes to the political process, but suddenly, and this was the same, by the way, with the Occupy Wall Street, the major story was there are people for whom. This is the most important, about the environmental movement which went on the street. Belarus is interesting from a very paradoxical point of view, and watching it, I was in a certain way kind of a lot of moved, because this is like in a classical literature. Basically, on one side, totally not organized people, because everybody was put in prisons. So you have first all these young women standing for their arrested husbands. It was this was a kind of a Lukashenko-made feminism. When basically you arrest all the husbands, the wives came. And they, by the way, became political leaders, genuine political leaders. I do believe in a certain way more authentic than their husband would have ever been. But secondly, this was also kind of the paradox, success of the Lukashenko project. We saw that there is a Belarusian nation. Listen, Belarusian nation was not easy to be figured out. Ethnically very close to Russia. So he started to develop a nation-state project after the end of the Soviet Union, which was contrary to everything else. All other post-Soviet republics started to develop a kind of an ethnic identity for their states. It was easier, of course, for the Ukrainians, who used to have a state before. It was easier for Georgia, for Armenia. But how are you doing this in Belarus? By the way, the part of Europe where most people died during the World War II. Every third person in Belarus was destroyed. So basically, Lukashenko came in 1994 and said, we are the last Soviet Union. When everybody was basically running out of the Soviet Union, he created the Belarusian identity as a Soviet identity. Have you noticed that for the first time since Solidarity, we're talking about workers striking? During the Ukrainian events, the question was, which side different oligarchs are going to take. In Belarus, basically, because it's a state-owned companies, it was the workers came back. You start to talk about this. Secondly, for also other reasons, but this was the end of the Soviet perestroika. On one side, you have the government using the old Soviet patriotic songs from the World War II, trying to silence the protest, and on the other, the protesters who are using Soviet songs against from the 1980s to try to signal that they need change. Thirdly, also we saw how the world has been changed. There was no European flags and there was no American flags for sure. And this is because people were wise enough to know that the only way for them basically to have a change that they were wanted was to signal to Moscow that we want a regime change, but we don't want a geopolitical change. I do believe all this about Belarus is amazing, but there is one image which is going to stay with me all the time. And we have seen a lot of protests, and Black Lives Matter have been on television recently. So there was a demonstration of the protesters, and one boy was going on the shoulders of the other boy in order basically to say something. And do you know what he did? He took his shoes off. In a kind of a very patriarchal way, like going in a kind of a other person's house. I'm saying this because Belarus was the kind of the most graphic clash. On one side was a power, which was a cruel power. It was not simply the demonstrators have been arrested. People have been tortured because the message of the government was beat them in order to remember. So this is not simply that you're isolating people or detaining people. And on the other side was civility. Have you noticed that there was no single act of violence when you have hundreds of thousands of people protesting every Sunday? So I'm saying all this because, of course, there are different protests, but one of the bigger issues, and I do believe this is what you're saying, how you are transforming this energy into power. And this is the strength, but also the weakness of the protests, which are basically based on trying to represent the people, the sovereign. In order to do it, they're trying not to make a classical political claims. And this is why this is so important, what is happening on the elections and these relations between the protests and the elections. And this is something that is making a very strong kind of impression on me, because some of these protests can be easily used to legitimize the status quo that people have been protesting against. On the other side, they really can brought a totally new consensus, new issues, new things. But you're not going to do it from the street. In a certain way, the problem of the political leadership comes. And this is where you cannot expect this to happen just on the street.
So maybe one more question, Ivan, and then we could turn to a few questions from Thomas and one from myself on the essayistic and the literature part of the evening. But one maybe a political question which you address in your The Light That Failed. It talks about a politics of imitation, where there is enormous resentment fueled by the fact that Eastern European citizens and societies are being now made to manufacture themselves in the image of Western liberal democracies. But then there is a strange reversal of this imitation, if you like, and that is that you are getting an export now from the East to the West of something one could call soft authoritarian regimes. So it's now Putin, Orban, Erdogan, who seem to more and more export a playbook for this kind of regime to Trump and to Johnson. I mean, maybe they're not really studying each other that closely, but the flow of ideas seems to be in the other direction. But at least what we are seeing, and there Belarus is also not an exception, I think is a very interesting and toxic mixture of crony capitalism. It's not a market which is functioning in any of these places. It's ethno-nationalism. It's a really macho kind of strong man, so toxic masculinity, and a majoritarian democratic principle, which basically, not even hypocritically, wants to protect minority rights. It's explicitly saying that democracies are about elected majorities. Do what you want. So this obviously changes the entire nature of the kind of models which are then available. And it's, in a sense, I mean, I don't even want to say it's a Chinese model which is being exported now to everybody, but certainly models which are now available, which are no longer liberal, definitely, and some of them are not even democratic in any real sense of the term.
Yeah, thank you very much. And when we started this book, The Light That Fell, with Stephen Holmes, if you like something in the book, is probably what this is his ideas. But one of our feelings was that certain period has ended, and it was for us very important to understand what is the nature of this period, and where Shalini is right, we were not interested what we did wrong or what went wrong, but try to understand, because it was a very exceptional period. Listen, people are imitating all the time. When you see any success, you're imitating it. This is basically how politics works. But at the same time, what was interesting about 1989 was that there was a big change, and everybody had the feeling that we know in which direction the world is going. So from this point of view, the end of history, which everybody tries to ridicule now, captured certain type of a spirit of the time, because the idea was that not that every society is going to become like the Western societies, but this was the only model worth imitating, because there were two big universalist ideologies clashing during the Cold War, and one of them was not simply defeated. One of them basically committed a suicide, saying that basically it does not work. It is not that the Americans basically captured Moscow or Beijing. It was that Soviet and Chinese leaders said our system did not work. And this is different. And for us, this type of imitation was critically important. And talking about Jean Améry, he's a person very much interested in the problem of resentment, his own resentment. He basically was very resentful how easily the West took Germany back. And it was something interesting because you can see part of it. Resentment is critical to understand the psychological power behind people like Orban or Kaczynski or Putin. There are different types of resentment, for sure, of what you're losing. But one of the major stories, particularly when it comes to the resentment of this kind of an anti-communist far right that came to power, was that everything happened too easy. Where is our victory? If all are Democrats today, this destroys our identity from before, when it was a much more divided society. And I'm saying this because, of course, now we are going to have an imitation of particular things like the way you attack media, the way you're attacking courts. But do you know what is the difference between this imitation and the imitation in which we have been interested after 1989? In 1989, particularly in Eastern Europe, we tried to transform our societies. We really wanted to be like the West. It is not a colonization. It was the decision which societies took. From this point of view, of course, imitation was critically important in the way to understand what is happening, for example, in the global South. But the colonization, you don't have nobody in India decided that India should become a British colony. So while in Central and Eastern Europe, the idea was we want to be like the West. But out of we want to be like the West, three important things happened. First, if the future is the West, and if the borders are open, why should I wait for Bulgaria to become like Germany, and why not to come to Germany and immediately start to live in the future? And this is quite important because the revolutionaries likes to live in the future. So one of the effects of the liberal revolutions was that the first who left were the liberals. And in a certain way, if you see, you cannot imagine Trotsky in 1918 taking a fellowships to go to Oxford. But even Viktor Orban did. And this is a different situation. And so you have this effect. The second effect is, I want to be like you, but because I want to be like you, at the same time I recognize that there is something wrong with me. And with the passing of time, this is becoming politically kind of a poisonous. But thirdly comes the problem for the West. If everybody wants to be like you, then you are fine. And I do believe as a result of this period of imitation, the Western democracies totally lost a self-critical perspective on themselves. Listen, normally the discourse of democracy was, we are doing badly, we are failing. This was normally how the democracies talk about themselves. In 1983, the bestseller book, probably if there was a Jean Améry Prize, it was going to be given to this book back then, was François Ravel, who wrote the book, Why Democracy Will Perish. And he was basically arguing very convincingly why the Soviet Union is going to win the Cold War. It was 1983, it was not 1950, it was not 1970, because for democracy, all the time was very important how vulnerable we are, how many problems we have. And then suddenly come 1989. And all the world wants to be like you. So if others believe that you're so good, you must be so good. And as a result of it, the critical discourse within the Western societies basically totally declined. And I do believe part of the crisis that we see is very important. But the way, for example, Bolsonaro is going to imitate Putin or President Trump is not the same like Central and East Europeans wanted to imitate the West. Bolsonaro is not doing something that he does not want to do. Basically, attacking the press or going against the minority, for example, what Modi is doing, it's not an idea that comes unnaturally to him. He simply uses these precedents in other places to justify policies that basically he has been always interested to have. For Central and East European societies, many of the things that we have been doing were not part of the natural way that it goes. For example, respect for minorities from the places that we come. It's not so obvious coming. And we have been doing this because we wanted to become like the West. It's none of these leaders who are imitating, for example, President Putin and others, who are doing something that is perceived against their interest. It's not something that Modi is going to transform. You're bringing certain type of techniques of governing and so on. You're doing this all the time. But I do believe that there is a major difference between imitation as transformation, something that we saw in the 1990s with all these positive and negative things, and what we basically see today of kind of imitating the successful kind of semi-authoritarian elected authoritarian leaders.
So maybe one question just to follow up on that, and I think that's a good one to link to some of the questions Thomas has, and that is, even if Western societies lost their capacity for self-critique, the question is, what role does an intellectual have in the society then? But more particularly, we are in a literature festival. The question is, something has happened to the critical role, the provocative role that literature used to have. Demonstrations outside of Burg Theater have just disappeared. Whereas they used to be part of the order of the day. And obviously people got really provoked by what they saw on stage. So something has changed about the place of literature, of performance, drama in society. And I think that may be a good mirror to think through, or it's another optic to look at, which may be an interesting one that could lead to some of the questions Thomas has.
Like you, I do believe that we are seeing major change. And to be honest, when you're receiving a literary award and you're a political scientist, this is the end of your political science career, you know it. From this point of view, my career was born out of an email, but it is going to end up with an award. But here is the interesting story, because like Shalini, I have been very much thinking about this. There was a beautiful book by the Spanish author, Mr. Cercas, which is called The Imposter. And it's a non-fiction book. This is the story of a Spanish person who for the last 10 or 15 years, before basically the scandal erupted, basically has become the face of survivors of the concentration camps in Spain. So a person like this will go into parliament and give a speech on behalf of the survivors. He was very popular. He was extremely effective. He was really moving the audiences. And then a historian made a check, and it appeared that he never had been in a concentration camp. And as you can imagine, this was a huge scandal. But the Cercas book is saying, listen, in what extent we the writers are different? We always try to have a life which is not our own. Of course, we're not doing this in this way, but literature was very much allowing people basically to have different lives, to be other people. I'm saying this because one of the interesting things that is happening to literature is that what is challenged is exactly this. For example, if I'm going to write a fiction tomorrow on behalf of African refugee, and this is going to be narrated in the first, basically it's going to be the I narration. It is going to be a scandal. And people are going to say, how are you going to write it? You have never been there. You don't have this experience. There is something disrespectful for what you're doing. And for literature, this is a major issue. Because suddenly people are asked to write only about their real experience. And what is really important is, and this is where I do believe you're right, suddenly we can do very radical things with ourselves. We can be anywhere. We can change our agenda. We can do this. People said, if you really want to write about this, do it first. Go in Africa, come as an African refugee, stay with these people and write this book. But I'm not going to allow you to stay in Vienna or in Sofia and writing a book. And even if the book is a good book, there is something even more wrong with this, if people like it. And for me, this is a major challenge for the very understanding of literature. Because literature was about living lives which normally we're not living. Imagining how many writers have been writing about cities that they have never been visiting. trying to imagine situations that were never there. And for me, this is interesting, and this goes to this idea of, do you know, there was a famous game, Dare or Truth? I don't know.
Truth or Dare.
Yeah. So this is, I don't know how popular it is in Germany. It was quite popular in my students' day in Bulgaria. So you have a group of friends, and basically you have two options. You either are going to be asked to do something daring, for example. Back then it was get naked. I don't believe it's daring now. Or you're going to be asked a question, and you should answer honestly, and the question is going to be a tough question. And I do believe suddenly literature was pushed in this game. And this for me is, I very much agree, something has changed in the nature of literature. It is not about the classical story that art is provoking and changing the limits. The problem is, and probably strangely enough, the art can start to play a much more conservative role, trying to convince people that there are limits. Because, yeah.
On that fascinating note, Shalini and I could go on well into the early morning hours asking Ivan more questions, but both unfortunately and fortunately, our time is up, and I'd like to introduce Ulrike Dresner to read out the prize for Ivan.
Good evening. I'm going to read the statement of the jury in German and English. Die Klarheit des Denkens gegen die Verabredungen der Zeit. Das ist es unter anderem, was Ivan Krastev mit Jean Améry gemeinsam hat. Krastev untergräbt in seinen Annäherungen an unsere Gegenwart diskursive Oberflächen, um ganz im Sinne des Jean Améryschen Aufklärungsbegriffs das Augenmerk darauf zu richten, was verdrängt wird und nicht wieder gut zu machen ist, umso mehr aber bedacht gehört. Er untersucht in seinem Werk akribisch die Frage, was Demokratie und Liberalismus jenseits des Phrasenhaften bedeuten, und macht deutlich, dass ihre Tragfähigkeit nur dann gegeben ist, wenn immer wieder aufs Neue verstanden wird, dass Freiheit immer die Freiheit der Andersdenkenden ist. Statement of the jury. An extraordinary clarity of thought in analyzing the facile agreements of our times is one of the many features linking Ivan Krastev's work to Jean Améry. Krastev's approaches to pressing topical subjects undermine discursive surfaces and, in accordance with Jean Améry's concept of enlightenment, draw our attention to violations, tabooed and beyond repair, that need to be elucidated. In his essays, Krastev pungently shows that we need to live up to the real challenges of democracy and liberalism that will only be able to guide us through these times if we are willing to constantly renew our understanding of the fact that freedom necessarily comprises the freedom of those who think differently. All my best congratulations to Ivan for the Jean Améry Prize.
Thank you very much. Because when I was looking to the audience, I do believe that there is something very good and egalitarian about the COVID-19. Seeing a half the empty room, which is by regulation. I do believe now we're equally good. Nobody can fill the room.